All right, Betty.
All right, we're going to continue in the book of Ruth, eighth book in the Old Testament, right after Judges and right before 1 Samuel. Now we're going to do like a recap. It's probably going to be a longer recap than I normally would do just because it's been 2 months. We don't even remember what we ate for breakfast. Never mind remembering a Bible study from 2 months ago. So we'll do a more in-depth study or a recap. I'll start by asking someone to read verses 1 through 13, and we'll do a recap from there. So Ruth, chapter 1, verses 1 through 13.
In the days when the judges ruled, there was a famine in the land, and a man of Bethlehem in Judah went to sojourn in the country of Moab, he and his wife and his 2 sons. The name of the man was Elimelech, and the name of his wife Naomi. And the names of his 2 sons were Mahlon and Chilion. They were Ephraimites from Bethlehem in Judah. They went into the country of Moab and remained there. But Elimelech, the husband of Naomi, died, and she was left with her 2 sons. These took Moabite wives. The name of the one was Orpah, and the name of the other was Ruth. They lived there about 10 years, and both Mahlon and Chilion died, so that the woman was left without her 2 sons and her husband. Then she arose with her daughters-in-law to return to the country of Moab, for she had heard in the fields of Moab that the Lord had visited his people and given them food. So she set out from the place where she was with her 2 daughters-in-law, and they went on the way to return to the land of Judah. But Naomi said to her 2 daughters-in-law, "Go return, each of you to her mother's house. May the Lord deal kindly with you, as you have dealt with the dead and with me. The Lord grant that you may find rest, each of you in the house of her husband." Then she kissed them. They lifted up their voices and wept. Then they said to her, "No, we will return with you to your people." But Naomi said, "Turn back, my daughters. Why will you go with me? Have I yet sons in my womb that they may become your husbands? Turn back, my daughters, go your way, for I am too old to have a husband. If I should say I have hope, even if I should have a husband this night, and should bear sons, would you therefore wait till they were grown? Would you therefore refrain from marrying? No, my daughters, for it is exceedingly bitter for me, for your sake, that the hand of the Lord has gone out against me."
Let's pray real quick. Our Lord and our God, we do thank you, God. We thank you that you have sent your Son to save your people, Lord. And you said that it was finished, and it indeed was finished. You came and you completed the work on our behalf, and Lord, we thank you for that. We thank you, Lord, that even now we're able to come and to study your scriptures, oh Father. And Lord, we ask that you would press it on our hearts, oh Lord, that you would convict us of areas in which we sin and use that to drive us back to you, oh Father. We thank you, Lord, for this book and the beautiful reminder that you are sovereign, even in our affliction, even in our trials and tribulation. So, Lord, we pray that you would be with us tonight and that your name would be glorified. Praise in Christ. All right, so just let's do a recap. I broke it up pretty much into 3 sections. We only got through a section and a half last time. Essentially from verses 1 to verse 5, we see Naomi becoming a widow, right? And immediately in the first 2 verses, we're set up with the context, right? It speaks about the days when the judges governed. So that's the climate of the book of Ruth. It was during the days of the judges, and we spoke about this last time. But what was the climate like in the days of judges, except for Claudia, because I think she answered last time. So what were the days like during the days of judges?
What was it like?
Yeah.
So the people would rebel. they were told to do something they wouldn't, they would plead out to the Lord for a judge, for a ruler, someone to guide them. God would send them someone, that person would be turn narrow for a little bit and kind of go off and do their own thing and then fall again, and it was like just continual falling, asking for someone to help them, God sends, falling, rebelling, falling, rebelling.
Okay, anyone else want to add to that or no?
All men did was right in their own eyes.
Sums up like the book of Judges in that one verse, right? Judges 21:25 says, "In those days Israel had no king. All the people did whatever seemed right in their own eyes." So it was a day in which sin was rampant, right? Even the good judges, they fell and they were swayed. God would appoint these judges to kind of to lead them, and they would fail in leading them and leading the people. And so they would do what was right in their own eyes according to their own standard. And we know that anytime we as humans do anything according to our own ways or what is right in our own eyes, it never ends well. It never ends well. So that's the context, and this is the climate of the book of Ruth. They're living during a time where people are just doing what is right in their own eyes, and sin and wickedness is rampant. We also spoke, right? The conflict or the problem here is that there's a famine, and because of this famine, this drives essentially the whole book, right? It's because of this famine that they end up leaving Bethlehem, and they go to the land of Moab, right? We spoke about Elimelech, who was the husband. He was the leader. He's leading them out of the city of Bethlehem to go to Moab, because in Moab there's food, right? And in Bethlehem there was a famine, so he's trying to avoid and he's trying to avoid starvation, and death. So he goes to the place where there's food. And we spoke about there being several ironies within this, right? The first being Bethlehem itself means house of bread, and the house of bread, or the granary of bread, is out of bread, right? There's a famine, and they currently have no food. So that's the first irony. The second irony is that Elimelech, his name means "my God is king," right? Strangely enough, what he does and what his actions show is contrary to what his name means, right? He's leading his family from the land of Bethlehem to a land where they do not worship the true and living God. The land of Moab was a wicked land, right? Sin was rampant there too, and he's leading his family into that so that he would not starve. The other irony is that he leaves to kind of flee death, and he ends up going to Moab to die and leave his wife. Not only does he die, but his kids end up marrying Moabite women, right? And then they end up dying. So just in the first 5 verses, we see pretty much nothing but tragedy in Naomi's life. We see that she's facing a famine, husband dies, the kids marry Moabites, and then the kids die. And all she's left with is the Moabite women. So that's pretty much verses 1 through 5. Then verses 6 through 18, what we begin to see is Ruth's loyalty to Naomi. And there's like an immediate shift from verses 5, right? Verses 1 to 5 is just kind of an account. Verses of all that's going on. Verse 6, we see that Naomi decides to go back to the land of Judah, right? Back to Bethlehem. And from here, we begin to see a kind of a transition from her own. We only see bad news to her, like, God begins to bless her, and we see blessings begin to kind of occur in her life. We see like a change in that way. And the main reason why she's going back to the land of Bethlehem, or to Bethlehem, is because she heard that the Lord has visited his people, right? Meaning he's provided food. The famine is no more, right? He is providing for his people. And Naomi's response to this news is immediate, right? She hears that there's food, and the first thing she does is she arises, and she ends up returning from the land of Moab to Bethlehem. It says that she went out where she was staying. And then in verses 8 through like 13 and kind of on, what we're seeing is Naomi has her two daughters-in-law, Orpah and Ruth, and she's pleading with them, or she's trying to encourage them in a sense to stay, right? She lost her two kids, right? The tradition in that day would be, if your husband dies, then you would marry, your brother-in-law in essence, and they would take over, and they would take care of you, and they would, you would be given to them, and you would be given over to them in marriage. But Naomi tells them, I have no other kids. I don't even have a husband. So essentially, there's no hope. Like, she's encouraging them to stay in Moab, where she knows they're going to be with the Moabites, with their own people. They're going to be amongst, a place where they can find food, they can find another spouse, and they can continue on with their lives. Going back to Bethlehem, there was a lot of uncertainty, and she knew for certain that she didn't have anyone else to give her. She didn't have any other sons to give over to them. So she's encouraging them to kind of stay here, to stay in the land of Moab, and she's going to go back. And here's where we begin to see the commitment from Ruth to Naomi, right? It's a back and forth. She's telling them, stay, stay, stay. And Ruth and Orpah are saying that they're going to go with her, right? They don't want to forsake Naomi and let her go by herself. They're committed to her. So that's kind of where we left off. And we'll continue on just seeing Ruth's commitment to Naomi, and then them returning back to Bethlehem. So if someone could read verses 14 through 22.
Then they lifted up their voices and wept again. And Orpah kissed her mother-in-law, but Ruth clung to her. And she said, See, your sister-in-law has gone back to her people and to her gods. Return after your sister-in-law. But Ruth said, Do not urge me to leave you or to return from following you. For where you go, I will go, and where you lodge, I will lodge. Your people shall be my people, and your God my God. Where you die, I will die, and there will I be buried. May the Lord do so to me and more also, if anything but death parts me from you. And when Naomi saw that she was determined to go with her, she said no more. So the two of them went on until they came to Bethlehem. And when they came to Bethlehem, the whole town was stirred because of them. And the women said, Is this Naomi? She said to them, Do not call me Naomi, call me Mara, for the Almighty has dealt very bitterly with me. I went away full, and the Lord has brought me back empty. Why call me Naomi when the Lord has testified against me, and the Almighty has brought calamity upon me? So Naomi returned, and Ruth the Moabite, her daughter-in-law, with her, who returned from the country of Moab, and they came to Bethlehem at the beginning of barley harvest.
right, thank you. All right, so in verse 12, we begin to see Naomi pleading with her two daughters, right? She's just been through so much tragedy, right? Kind of put yourself in Naomi's shoes, right? And all that she's been through. And what is the first thing that happens when we go through trials? What is our reaction normally as believers? What is typically doubt, right? Fear. What else?
Asking God why.
Right? We ask God why. You know, a lot of the times we blame shift. You know, or we just, you know, or either we blame it on God or we think that there's something wrong with us, right? That a particular sin has caused me to be in this situation. And it may be the case that sin has put you in the situation. It may not be the case. But, yeah.
Basically, on trial for something that you have never done. Are you going to speak the truth?
Oh, we're not talking about
No, they say when you go through a trial, right? Any trial, the truth comes out from that trial.
Are you talking about a trial in court, or are you talking?
No, I'm talking about
like a tribulation?
No.
Yeah, the truth comes out by your actions, right? But typically, what happens is we know the truths of the scriptures. We know the attributes of God. We know that God is sovereign. But then we need to reconcile those things to the reality, right? And a lot of the times we don't immediately reconcile those things together. We don't reconcile the fact that God is sovereign and God is in control, and we don't connect that to our present circumstances. And this is how Naomi is sort of feeling here, and this is why she's pleading with her two daughters-in-law not to go with her, right? She's just been through a lot, and she probably thinks that she's going to continue to go through a lot, and she doesn't want them to go through a lot. So I think, you know, the book the book of Ruth is beautiful because although in the immediate context and in her present circumstance, although she doubts and she doesn't see the sovereignty of God working, we do see later on the sovereignty of God working in Naomi's life and in Ruth's life, and she uses Ruth as a form of encouragement to show her, you know, the grace of God. So what are some things that we need to do as believers to remember God's love and God's unfailing love during times of uncertainty? What are things that we need to do? Yeah.
I think one of the things that has helped me is receive encouragement from other believers. So like be honest with, you know, people that God has put in your life. God uses them to like, you know, by His word, like, you know, speak His like truth to you.
All right. So in this case, we see Ruth kind of is going to be that for Naomi. What else? What are other things that we ought to be doing in times of uncertainty?
I was going to say, like today, we know the scriptures a lot better than what they did in that time. So she was, you know, when things happened, she wasn't totally aware. They weren't as aware of the sovereignty of God the way we are today. Then also back in that day, she was a woman. What rights did she have? She had no husband, no son, no man to speak for her. And then when it's an older woman walking with a younger woman, who's going to treat her with respect, you know, because she was a woman. You know, they were more like a second-class citizen then. So she had that further disadvantage. And also, she's not, from what I see, she's not totally aware. I mean, who would send a woman back to her pagan gods? You know, I mean, is she really better off going back to her homeland, which earthly wise, everything is fine, you know? She'll find another husband, she'll find another pagan to live with, and then she would be totally unsafe. She doesn't encourage them to come, because even though it'd be rough, you get to know my God. What's better than knowing my God instead of sending them back to some other one?
Yeah, that's a good point.
Because it wasn't taught that way back then.
That's a good point. It's a good point, and we'll see that Ruth kind of catches on to this if she acts the contrary. But
where Ruth is part of God's elect, so when she hears these different things, it's like music to her ears. She's interested. She wants to know more. Where the other sister-in-law, she was told to go back, and she said, "Okay, I'll go back. Bye."
Yeah. Yep.
I would say about I'm sorry. Can you ask the question again?
The question was, how can we remember, and cling to God's love in times of uncertainty? What are
Right.
things that we ought to do?
I pray instantly at the moment when that's happening. Even though it might not be much, like we have so many great examples, and this also goes with this, like in the Psalms, but just pouring out our hearts to the Lord about our feelings and what we're going through.
I was gonna say 2 things I do is I study through the attributes of God. So every day is a different letter of the whole alphabet, and I go through it, and then I take notes and stuff of where you see it in the Bible and history where it happened. So when I'm going through something, it's good to look back and to see who is God. And also I write letters to myself. If that makes sense, using the scriptures a lot of times in different people's stories that I can relate in. I'll write that down and write kind of a letter to myself, hey, you're not alone, this person's going through, and you can see it through scripture.
Yeah, definitely. All right, thank you guys. So yeah, we should definitely obviously we ought to be looking back to the attributes of God. We ought to be in scripture, but we ought to be, we ought to be praying. Most of the time we know the truth, we know the reality of who God is, but it's just, our circumstances are just, they're not connecting with, what's in our heart. And we ought to be praying that the Lord would align our hearts to who He is and knowing who He is. And that really helps. But definitely in the case of Naomi, without Ruth, she probably would have been somewhere different, right? But God uses Ruth as a means of grace in Naomi's life, and God uses us as a means of grace in one another's lives. And I think that's why fellowship is so critical, and being committed to one another, committed to the body, serving the body, loving the body is so crucial for not only the person, other people that you encounter, right? It's important that you're invested in other people's lives, but also for your life, your spiritual walk, so that when you are going through circumstances that are difficult, someone is there to kind of encourage you. And in her circumstance, she was giving, like Ray pointed out, she was giving bad advice to her 2 daughters-in-law, because her view of God was a bit tainted because of what she was going through. And Ruth comes in and kind of eventually realigns her view of God, and helps her to get back to worshiping God as she ought to worship God. Yeah.
Yeah, it's just, thinking about what you were saying, I remember a while back, I experienced a hurt, and I was so down, so frustrated, I was so down and all, and I felt so hypocritical, coming from a legalistic background, which some of us, would understand what I'm talking about, But I said, oh God doesn't love me. Oh man, I've sinned. Oh man, I did this. Oh, I feel like a mope and everything, And it was Saturday, and I said, I don't think I'm going to go to church tomorrow. The very first thing that came to my mind was that I'm not going to go to church tomorrow. I'd rather just be by myself. Because like for me, my experience, whenever I've experienced a letdown or whenever I was hurt about something, I've always took it upon myself to close myself to everybody, you know, and not say anything because I didn't want to burden them, you know. And at that time, you know, yeah, in my mind, I knew who God was, but I did not think about His attributes, His sovereign, you know, sovereignty. He knows me. He created me. He knows my inner thoughts and all, you know. And I shared my heart, and I said, Lord, you know, Lord, forgive me. And when I was expecting rebuke, you know, since you were talking about coming together in fellowship, you know, all I got was love. And I said, wow, that was deep. Coming from a background was so legalistic, we say, no, you know, like that. As opposed to, yes, God has forgiven you and we love you. And, you know, and I tell you, it was, wow, it was deep. You know, it was really deep. And that's God's grace there.
All right. So let's continue. We're going to pick up from where we left off. Verse 14, it says, "And they lifted up their voices and wept again. And Orpah kissed her mother-in-law, but Ruth clung to her." So in verse 14, we begin to see emotions both from both of Naomi's daughters, right? Because they both loved Naomi. They both had just lost, in Naomi's case, she lost her husband and her sons. In Orpah and Ruth, they just lost their husbands, and they both went through that together. It's something difficult that they went through together. So, of course, you know, there's a bond there that they have. And so, Naomi's daughters-in-law have this bond, and they are committed to her. But really what we're seeing here is Ruth's commitment flourish for Naomi. Both of them have demonstrated, you know, their love for Naomi by crying out. But one kisses her and one clings to her. And the word cling is the same word that we see in Deuteronomy 13:4 and Genesis 2:24. Can someone pull those? Deuteronomy 13:4 and then Genesis 2:24.
Deuteronomy 13:4 says, "You shall follow the Lord your God and fear Him, and you shall keep His commandments, listen to His voice, serve Him, and cling to Him."
All right, so this verse is showing us that we ought to be intimate with the Lord, and it uses the word, and we ought to cling to Him. This is not like just loosely clinging. This is a close, tight, a tight-knit bond with the Lord, an intimacy with the Lord. And so it is, and so it was with Ruth and Naomi. Ruth had intimacy with the Lord. Someone could read Genesis 2:24.
Therefore a man shall leave his father and his mother and hold fast to his wife, and they shall become one flesh.
Right. So the word "hold fast" in the ESV, same word, same Greek word, cling or joined. Right. It wasn't a loose commitment that Ruth had to Naomi. She was stuck on Naomi, and no matter what Naomi said, Ruth was sticking with her. And we see it. Not only do we see it being said in words from Ruth to Naomi, but we're seeing it kind of being fleshed out in the life of Naomi and her actions. So we see the difference between Orpah and Ruth. And although Orpah's decision, right, although it wasn't condemned by Ruth, she didn't say, you should have stayed with me. We do see that Ruth's decision was commended in chapter 2. And we see the fruit of Ruth's decision in staying with her mother-in-law. Obviously, from Ruth's perspective, after hearing You know, Naomi taught her 4 times to stay at the land of Moab, and then her sister-in-law Orpah leaving. There must have been a temptation on behalf of on Ruth's side to kind of just go and go back to Moab. That was the easy thing to do. But she was obviously battling this strong will and this strong love for her mother-in-law. So not only does Naomi say that she's willing to go with, not only does Ruth say that she's willing to go with Naomi,
Excuse me.
but when, yeah,
No, okay, finish your statement. I'm
okay.
sorry.
But when push comes to shove, Ruth follows through with her commitment. It's not simply verbal. And no matter what Naomi said, it wasn't going to stop Ruth from going with her.
Yeah, I was thinking that when Orpah decided to go back and Ruth so dedicated to her mother-in-law, she might have thought, well, wow, she's leaving. Now I really have to stay with her because I love her so much. And before she had the 2 of us, now she only has me. And I love her so much, I really can't leave now. That maybe might enforce her feeling to stay.
Yeah, it could have very well enforced her, and it could have very well made her want. It was probably more of a temptation for her to leave. It was just an added temptation,
Yeah,
right?
no, but I would think that because they emphasized how much she loved her, that it's possible the temptation never really crossed her mind. I'm staying with this woman no matter what. Her people would be my people, her God would be my God. So I would think she has no interest in going back to the life that she had before.
Yeah.
Who knows?
Yeah. Good insight. Yeah.
I was just thinking that Naomi, having gone through what she's gone through, gave the best advice, the best human advice, the best natural advice, right? Like a lot of times we see circumstances and we give advice, the best from our knowledge. She meant well because she loved them. Obviously, they had a good relationship. And it's a lesson, I guess, to myself to know that it's good to trust God in the process and ask Him, like somebody had said that, to ask Him, because when you give advice, to make sure that it is what God wants you to give advice for, because the human advice is always the easy answer.
Mm-hmm.
But God has a plan that's far beyond.
Right. And the last study we spoke of, Elimelech's decision to go to Moab, it was the natural thing for him to
There's
do,
food there.
right? And it was him fending for himself instead of calling upon the name of the Lord to provide. He was resolving his situation on his own. And when we do that, when we try and resolve the situation by our own strength and through our own means, sometimes it doesn't end well, And
Right. And then also, the father, he goes to Moab, so that was the one wrong thing to do. But he looked at it as the most common sense thing. And then his sons take it one step further, and they marry Moab women.
Yep.
That makes the consequences of the chances of that being not good.
Yep. And we spoke about this last time. A lot of times we make decisions based off practicality, right? We want to move, right? Just an example. We want to move to a house, to a state. It's more affordable, but we don't consider if there's a good church, if there's a sound church, how it will hinder my spiritual life. Like sometimes we put our practical needs before our spiritual needs, and it doesn't end well. Not for our spiritual lives. It takes a toll on our spiritual lives, and that's what happened with Elimelech, and we see that it didn't end very well for him. So we see Naomi's commitment. it's followed through with action. And in verse 15, what we're seeing is Orpah has returned, and so Naomi again is trying to compel Ruth to follow her path. And what's interesting is that she says that Orpah has returned back to her people, and she has returned back to her gods. It's plural. So in a sense, returning back to Moab equates to returning back to her gods. It equates to worshiping another god. In the land of Moab, she's not going to find, if everyone else is not worshiping the true God, how is she going to worship the true God? It's like me going, to a land where there is no church, where there are no believers. I'm more prone to worship and do the same things that everyone else is doing. It's going to be very hard, not impossible, but it's going to be very hard for me to continue to flourish in the Lord. And so Naomi is compelling her to follow her, but she's going to go back to her people with her gods. And we kind of spoke about this last time. Moabites obviously did not worship the true God. They worship the god of, and I'm going to butcher the name, Shamash. I don't know if I'm saying that wrong. It's right. They were known to worship that god and multiple other gods, but mainly that god.
What did that god mean?
Huh?
What did the god mean?
I don't know what the god meant. And we read in Numbers 21:29, "Woe to you, O Moab! You are ruined, O people of Shamash. He has given his sons as fugitives and his daughters into captivity to an Amorite king." So here, reinforcing the idea that that the land of Moab and the Moabites worship this god. Right? Again, we see it in Jeremiah 48:46. "Woe to you, Moab, the people of Shamash, haven't perished, for your sons have been taken away captive, and your daughters into captivity." Right? The land usually, back in the day, usually what distinguished what god they worship was either the people or the land or the culture or the language or their theology. Like that was all kind of associated with the land that they were from. And the land of Moab was associated with Shamash, right? The Shamash, the god of Shamash. And this is where Orpah was going, and this is where Naomi was trying to encourage Ruth to go back to. So although she appeals to Ruth, Ruth is clinging to her, right? And like you said, it might have very well been an enforcement for Naomi to kind of cling even more. Knowing that Moab, I mentioned last time, the main reason why Ruth is following Naomi is not only because she loves Naomi, but because she loves the God of Naomi. And this is like her main motive. And seeing that and knowing that the people of Moab don't worship this true God, does not give her inclination to go back, to stay in Moab, but instead to go with Naomi. Verse 16, it says, "But Ruth said, 'Do not urge me or turn back from following you. For where you go, I will go, and where you lounge, I will lounge. Your people shall be my people, and your God my God.'" Right? The first words we hear from Ruth's lips are probably the most known and most memorable from the book of Ruth. Where do we normally hear these words? Aside from the Bible.
Say it again.
Where do we normally hear this word, this verse, or this phrase? Huh? Kim work?
Jesus coach.
No, not her. Well, actually, it's more of verse 17. You know, where you die, I will die, and there will be. Normally, we hear this like something similar in wedding vows,
Yeah.
right?
Wedding vows.
No?
Yeah, where you are.
Yeah, I mean, it's a similar. It's not it's not the same exact words, but very similar. What we see in wedding vows and what we see here is a strong commitment to that person, and that's what we're seeing from Ruth to Naomi. She's showing her commitment to Naomi. Right? She begins by setting the record straight. Ruth is very persistent to stay with Naomi, but Naomi has also been very persistent to try to get her to stay in Moab. And what she's doing is she's trying to, she's imploring her, and it's more of an imperative to Naomi to stop telling me to stay here. I'm going to go with you, right? I'm not going to return. I'm not going to stay in the land of Moab. I'm going to return to your land, right? With your people, and your God will be my God, right? It's the natural response to stay where she is, but that would mean that she would have to abandon Naomi, and she's not going to do that. And this is the reason why she starts off this statement by telling her, stop telling me to leave you.
Excuse me, it's just a simple case of a man plans his way, but it's the Lord that directs their steps. So the plan was to stay, but God is behind it. So God's way, they don't realize the sovereignty yet of God.
Yeah, they don't, but they will.
They will.
And a lot of times we don't realize like God is working in the midst of our struggles, but He is. And then when we look back after it's all done, we do see the hand of God. We do see how God worked, and how He used it to get us, get us through. Yeah.
When the husband died, or Naomi died, the sons, they got married.
Yeah.
And they got into their wives.
Yep.
They don't say much how after the sons died, how she, I would say, she, give testimony or about God of Israel, and it's not no indication that she was talking about God, but that's why I think so. She, in the end, when the sons died, I think so. It's normal to tell the daughters-in-law that I have nobody, so I go back. So you guys from here, stay here because, but something probably, and Ruth, she saw somehow the hands of God in Naomi. That's why she maybe, no, that's why she decided to follow her. Besides love.
Yeah, no, I would say the main reason is she saw that her God was the true God, and she wanted to follow Yahweh instead of following the God of Moab. I'm not going to keep butchering the name, so I'm just going to say the God of Moab. So yeah, definitely. But what we're seeing here in like this poetic statement, or the statement from Ruth is kind of intensifying her commitment, to Naomi, so she can get the point that she's going with her, whether she likes it or not. But she's doing it in a very loving way. And we see not only will she not leave Naomi, but she affirms her determination to go where Naomi goes and to stay where Naomi stays, right? Understand that this is a big deal because Naomi's going back to the land of Bethlehem. She's a Moabite woman. She's not going to be as welcome as she would be if she went back to Moab or she stayed in Moab, right?
She's a Gentile.
Yeah, essentially, she's not Jewish. She's not from Bethlehem. So this would be a more difficult place to go and lay her head at and it would be more difficult for her to lay her head where Naomi laid her head. Yet Ruth was more than willing to go, right? And she says, "Your people will be my people." Right, and in a sense, Ruth understands that she's going to be renouncing, in a sense, the Moabites, and she's going to be renouncing the God of the Moabites, and she's going to be identifying with Naomi's people and Naomi's God, and she's okay with that. Ruth is okay with Naomi's God being her God, and I think that in a sense is showing, is showing fruit, is showing the faith that she's beginning to have in Yahweh or God. And then it says, it says that even in death she will cling to Naomi. It says, verse 17, "Where you die, I will die, and there I will be buried." Right? "Thus may the Lord do to me, and worse, if anything, but death parts you and me." So Ruth's determination to be with Naomi is not like just a temporary thing, right? She's essentially saying, "I'm in it for the long haul," right? When you die, I'm in it until you die, and after, because after she dies, Ruth obviously is younger, right? So most likely, obviously we don't know, but most likely Naomi is going to die first. If she does, Ruth is going to live in Bethlehem, and she's gonna be amongst Naomi's people. So she's saying, "I'm with you until you die and after, and I'm gonna be buried where you're buried." And being buried, obviously in your land was a big thing back then. You would be buried in your land, and this is what Ruth is saying: "I'm gonna be buried wherever you're buried," right? She's also by saying this, she's identifying, and she's saying that she considers herself part of Naomi's family. We're family. I'm not gonna leave you. We're family. Like, no matter what happens, I'm gonna be with you because we are family. And then she concludes and says, "Thus may the Lord do to me, and worse, if anything, but death parts you and me." Right? So she's essentially calling upon divine punishment upon herself should she fail to keep her word. She knows she's gonna keep her word, and she just seals it by saying this, by essentially, calling divine punishment on herself if she does anything else, right? And this finally it gets through to Naomi, right? It says in verse 18, when she saw that she was determined to go with her, she said no more. Finally, Naomi stops appealing to Ruth to stay in Moab, and then we see in verse 19, they begin to return to Bethlehem. So Naomi, in a sense, was impressed by this speech, and many of us would, seeing that great commitment from such a person. So we move on to 19. So they both went until they came to Bethlehem. And when they had come to Bethlehem, all the city was stirred up because of them. And the woman said, "Is this Naomi?" So we don't really receive much context about their travel time between Moab and Bethlehem. Right? So you could just imagine it was probably very difficult for them. They were only two women, and they had to travel quite a distance. But they also were dealing with everything, and probably they had a lot of time to think on everything that had happened to them, in the past 10 years. Because it was over the course of 10 or so years that all of this has happened. And now they're making their way back to Bethlehem. And there were probably a lot of questions as to what was going to happen, where would they end up. They didn't have full certainty. They just knew that the Lord had provided for his people in Bethlehem, and they were making their way over. It's not like they had everything set up and people were gonna welcome them and they were gonna have shelter right away and they were gonna a husband was gonna be waiting for them. They were going with a lot of unknowns and a lot of uncertainty. So verse 19, it says they arrived to Bethlehem, right? And it caused the city to be stirred. Now, why was the city stirred? Why is the city stirred?
Prominent family that left.
Prominent.
So it was a father, it was a man and his wife, and two sons that left during the famine, and they're still alive. So maybe many people in Bethlehem passed away because of the famine, I don't know. But now they're coming back and it's only her.
Yep. So.
And then also she's bringing a Gentile into the city, somebody who, all through history, Gentiles were never welcome. They were outcasts.
Yep.
So she's bringing this outcast, right into their area.
Right. So after 10 plus years of not seeing Naomi, she shows up unexpectedly, right? She shows up without letting anyone know. Obviously, it's probably there wasn't a good way of letting people know.
Couldn't send a telegram.
She probably didn't even know, who was still alive. But she shows up and she causes all this commotion in the city. It's and specifically the women, right? The men were probably working. It says the woman said, "Is this Naomi?" So it was particularly the woman. So this is probably an excitement for the people in Bethlehem. They're seeing Naomi after 10 plus years, and she's bringing a Moabite woman. So they probably have a lot of questions as to there's an excitement plus a lot of questions, and they're excited.
Are they excited or are they annoyed that she's bringing a Moabite woman home?
Well, I would say that it's a mixture of both.
The reaction I don't think is too good.
Well, after leaving for 10 years and seeing Naomi,
Yeah.
in seeing Naomi, they're excited.
Yeah, they're glad to see
But
her.
there's questions, obviously. There would be questions about why is she with a Moabite.
Right.
But it does make a little sense, being that she did go to the land of Moabite.
Yeah.
So similarly, when Jesus entered, can someone read it actually? Matthew 21, 10 and 11. Matthew 21, verses 10 and 11.
And when he entered Jerusalem, the whole city was stirred up, saying, "Who is this?" And the crowds said, "This is the prophet Jesus from Nazareth of Galilee."
Right, so Jesus here in Matthew 21, he's fulfilling the prophecy that he comes in riding on a donkey. They all start, a lot of people start worshiping him, and he enters into the city, and it causes a commotion. It causes people to be stirred up, and And obviously there are people there that are confused and they want to know what's going on. A lot of people are excited. There's a mixture of emotions, and it's causing the city to be stirred up. And this is the same thing that was happening among the women of Bethlehem. They were stirring up all this commotion because Naomi was back. And then the first thing that we hear from Naomi is she said to them, "Do not call me Naomi." Obviously, what did Naomi's name mean? Pleasant, right? So essentially they're reminding her of what her name means by calling her Naomi. And she says, instead, call me Mara. And what does Mara mean? Anyone know?
Bitterness.
Bitter, right? For the Almighty has dealt very bitterly with me. So here, it's kind of, Naomi pours out. She kind of vents to the people of Bethlehem that haven't seen her in years, right? They're probably excited, full of questions. And the first thing she says, don't call me that name. Instead, call me Mara, right? They don't know what she's been through, but she knows what she's been through. And her experiences have been anything but pleasant. And that's why she doesn't want to be called Naomi. She wants to be called Mara, right? She feels that God has dealt very bitterly with her. Yeah.
Could it be offensive to say that? Essentially, because she's saying, call me Mara, which is bitterness, like the way you're viewing God. Because I was thinking of Exodus with the Egyptians, and it was the same thing with the mirage and the water. And they called the same thing, it was Mara. So is that like, I guess like an insult, kind of like just viewing God, like, wow, God.
Yeah. I mean, I think that's what we all kind of struggle with when we're going through trials, right? When we don't understand, when we don't comprehend, and we view God a certain way that's not according to who He is, it is in a sense, offensive. It may not be God honoring. But this is where Naomi finds herself, right? And this is where we find ourselves a lot of times.
Can I say something?
Yep.
I think so that in this verse and the next verse too, I think so she recognized that is everything's coming from God. So probably she recognized that what they did when they went to the land of the Moab, it was wrong. And how the sons acted to get mad with the unsaved people. So that's why she recognized that the Lord, it's not that there was she don't know. She said, why God did this to me? But in some way, somehow, because after in the next verse, she also put more emphasis that the fact that it's the Lord that it brought a judgment to her family.
Yeah. Knowing, we're going to obviously get to verse 21, but knowing that she knew that it was God, right, that was at work, do you think her response in verse 20 was wrong? To kind of the same question that Rose had. Was it wrong on behalf of Naomi to respond in the way that she did?
Denise?
Yep.
This is just my thought. She's identifying with the bitterness, asking them to call her that, as though to overlook that which God has, everything else that God has done. Like, no, now I'm bitterness because of what's happened to me. So, in my opinion, I think that although it is a very understandable reaction, it's still not okay.
Because what about the verse that says, count it all joy when you enter trials and persecution, for it's for the Lord. So I was going to say it's wrong as Christians when we do enter situations similar to what Naomi goes through, and to kind of react in that way or want to be in that state.
So the follow-up question to what Denise said, just because it's our natural reaction doesn't mean that it's right, right? Because this is a natural reaction that we would all have, you know, that many of us would have, is to feel this way, but doesn't mean that it's right. No, right?
But she just lost her husband and her 2 sons.
So maybe we're gonna be like,
Yeah,
wow, you're
but-
wrong.
okay,
you're
but
offending
still.
God at the moment. I'm not gonna say that to her because she was wrong.
Yeah, she's
You're wrong.
grieving.
You're offending God.
She's grieving.
Yeah, she was
But it's
right.
like with Job, when he lost his whole family.
Yeah.
I mean, how he wished he at one point he was never born, right?
Well,
Yeah. Go ahead.
looking from the human, like trying to put myself in her shoes, right? You're hurt and you're not in your own surrounding, you're in a strange land. And now you're coming back to the land where you were kind of taken from by your husband. You're coming back and you're seeing people who recognize you. What would your reaction be? But to pour out your heart. And how do you start the conversation? But to tell them, I'm a mess, basically, right? Everything is wrong. You don't understand what I've been through. I kind of always looked at it in that way. Maybe that's like really superficial, but I try to put myself in her shoes. She's been through a lot. And she's going, and for the first time, she's back home. And there are people left that recognize her. And what is our tendency to share? Let me tell you what happened to me. Where do I start? And maybe that's the way, I mean, they spoke also very differently from what we do today. I'm not minimizing the wrong, because I struggled with that, like, why would you say that, you know? But I also, from a human perspective, think that she was sharing with the women that were there. And that was her starting point.
Right. Go ahead.
Yeah, I think that if in the same chapter, chapter 1, verse 13, I think it's the core of her complaint. Would you therefore wait until they were grown? If you therefore refrain from marrying? No, my daughters, for it is exceedingly bitter to me for your sake that the hand of the Lord has gone out against me. You know, so it could have been something that she felt that she was being, I guess for lack of a better word, you know, of a sin that, you know, that she felt that,
Yeah.
you know, that she was paying for because of what she was going through. You know, because again, going back, like in my experiences, like, you know, in the church that I was raised in, they always said, oh, well, you know, if you sin, God is going to do this, X, Y, and Z, X, Y, and Z, X, Y, and Z. You know, so in that sense, that, you know, that he was, you know, that she, you know, was saying, oh, you know, God is doing this because of that.
Yeah.
I think a lot of times we all say things wrong at different times.
Right.
Look at the Apostle Peter. I mean, some days he would say something that was straight from God himself, and then in the next moment he would put his foot in his mouth. So now, I mean, she's saying things that is not correct, but she's grieved, and it doesn't really say, but I'm sure that she realized what she said, you know, and it doesn't say, but, you know, it's very possible that she repented of it. And also, it was all, that whole thing was used for God's glory, because Ruth, who was effectually called by God, where she saw things in Naomi that she would never see back in Moab. She knew if she went back to Moab, she would never see anything like Ruth. And she loved what she saw in her. She loved the idea of how she reacted, how she did a lot of things, and how she talked about her God. She talked about her God most likely in a way that is never spoken about the gods that she used to serve. So she was called to that, and it was all part of God's plan.
Yeah. Okay. Well, I would say that, you know, although her you know, her circumstance was real, and you know, it's a natural response. I don't think that the response necessarily was the proper response. Obviously, when we're grieving and when we're going through things, it doesn't mean that we can't hurt and we can't feel pain. But to to consider what God has done, him dealing bitterly with you, when the scripture says that he works all things for the good of those who love him, would be a contradiction, right? I think Job has similarly felt the same way at times, right? And I think God's response to Job wasn't like he was commended for his responses. Instead, I think when God responds, and you can read more about it in Job 38, when God responds, he essentially like tells him like I am like essentially like he's God, like, and
You kind of chastise
yeah,
him.
he chastises him in chapter 38 for his thinking and for the way that he was perceiving things to come. In the beginning of Job, obviously, Job chapter 1, we see Job having the proper response. What does he say? He says, naked I come out of my mother's womb, and naked I shall return. The Lord gave, the Lord takes away. Right? He had the proper response, but as the book progresses, he begins to in a sense, think that God, is being bitter with him or has it out for him.
Just one thing, and correct me if I'm wrong. Wasn't that the Jewish mindset that whenever there was a sickness or death in the family, it was attributed to a sin?
Yeah.
Okay, because I'm thinking in the narrative in the New Testament, I can't remember where
John 9.
Yes. Right. So going back to that mindset, who sinned? Was he paying? What was he paying for? And all. Is that the reason why he is the way he is?
Wait, you're asking me another question, or are you just making that statement?
Just make a statement.
Okay. Yeah. So it could very well be that that's the case, but again, it is a bit of a contradiction. Although, like, we all kind of can relate to how she reacted because we commonly do it. Doesn't necessarily mean that it's right. Of course, the proper response would probably be what we see in Philippians 4, right? Where it says, don't be anxious about anything, but in everything by prayer and supplication, let your requests be made known to God. So obviously she could have dealt that with God, but to go and say that God has called me Mara because God has been bitter with me, essentially what she was doing also is she could have been tainting the people, the woman from Bethlehem's view of God, right? In essence, now they're hearing and they're saying, "Oh, she tainted, God tainted you, and now we should call you Mara." So now their view of God can in a sense be hindered or affected by what she's saying. So that's why I think that it wasn't the right thing to do.
Any other question? Do you think this was a chastening for her? In view of what Jose brought up in verse 13, like the second part of that? And the fact that they were in a pagan land, that they like deliberately went to a pagan land, and then 3 of the men died?
I think it may not have been a chastening for her, but I think it was a result of Elimelech's decision to go to Moab. And it shows us that, the husband, the leader of the home, has, their decisions affect the family, right? His decision to go to the land of Moab affected the whole family. That's what I think. I don't think Naomi had anything to do with it. She was a result of it, of his decisions. Yes, Sebastian.
I think so that what she was saying it was correct because the sons they get married after the husband died. So she maybe she didn't say to them, "We are not allowed to marry God's people." So I think so. She was really, when she said that God deal with her, she recognized that was thanks to God that there was a chastening that was right what God was doing. It's not.
Okay, I mean, I can see that. I think ultimately, Elimelech didn't bring him to the land of Moab, she wouldn't even be in that
Yes.
circumstance.
What I'm
But
saying,
I could see
I'm
that.
saying there was after,
Yeah.
so she was also responsible for what happened after God. She gets a set, go back to Bethlehem.
Yeah, I could see that.
Would her sons be in charge? Would her sons have been in charge?
Yeah. Let's finish up because it's 9:00. We'll finish. We'll wrap up verse 21, and then we'll continue on next time. Verse 21, it says, "I went out full, but the Lord has brought me back empty. Why do you call me Naomi, since the Lord has witnessed against me, and the Almighty has afflicted me?" Again, we see her kind of putting, saying that the Lord has afflicted her. And in fact, she did go through very difficult things. But I think here she's starting to recognize, and all throughout, I would say all throughout the chapter, although she was in the land of Moab, she didn't forget that the Lord was sovereign. Like, she knew that the Lord was sovereign. I think it was about connecting how she lived her life, with the reality that God was sovereignty, right? That God is sovereign. Like, she knew that God was sovereign. She was saying it, but her actions were not saying it. So it was about connecting the two things, and I think here she's beginning to see it, that He was sovereign, right? She goes in with her family, and ends up coming back, returning with just her daughter-in-law.
Would you say that she believes He's sovereignly bad and sovereignly evil instead of sovereignly good? That He rules everything, but that He's a bad God because of what He has caused in her life? And He also told Ruth to go with her sister. Did she mean for Ruth to go worship the gods with her sister? And then Ruth comes back and says, I want to follow you. I want to be where you are. I want to serve the true God. I'm just wondering if she's...
I definitely don't think that she thought that God was the God of evil. And I think everything was stemming from her focusing on her present circumstance. She wasn't properly, she wasn't properly thinking. She was hurting. And in doing so, she acted upon her circumstances in not all the correct ways, and we see kind of that's what we see from her. I don't think she thought Naomi was good. She just didn't understand. Like many of us, we don't understand why we go through tragedies, and a lot of times we don't act according to God's will in those moments. But it doesn't necessarily mean that we think that God is the God of evil, or we tell other people to worship other gods. It just means that we may not make the best decisions in those moments, and I think that's where fellowship comes in. I think that's where Ruth comes in, and by the end of the book of Ruth, her mindset is going to be in the proper place. Her mindset is going to be aligned to where to accordingly to God's character. So I think that's what we're seeing here, and we'll continue. And as we continue, we'll kind of the story will kind of unfold. But with that being said, it is past my time, so we'll stop there. I'll just pray really quick.